When we think of ancient Rome, we often imagine triumphal arches, aqueducts, marble temples, and the vast legions that conquered much of the known world. Rome is remembered as the birthplace of law, architecture, and civilization. But beneath the polished stone and the ideals of order, there was another Rome, a Rome that thrived on brutality, humiliation, and fear. This was a society where cruelty was not hidden, but displayed, where punishment was not simply about justice, but about spectacle, and where the lives of countless people were consumed by violence staged for the entertainment of the masses. At the very core of Roman cruelty stood crucifixion. It was not only a punishment, but a calculated performance of suffering. Crucifixion was considered the most degrading form of execution, reserved for slaves, rebels, and those who challenged Roman authority. The condemned were nailed or tied to wooden crosses, left exposed under the sun, their bodies slowly breaking down as birds circled above. Death could take hours, sometimes even days, as victims struggled to breathe, torn between suffocation and exhaustion. Perhaps the most infamous display of crucifixion was after the failed revolt of Spartacus. In 71 BCE, more than 6,000 slaves were lined up and crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies stretching for miles. For anyone walking that road, the message was unmistakable: defy Rome, and your death will not only be slow, but unforgettable. Yet crucifixion was just one of many inhumane acts the Romans perfected. In the great arenas of the empire, executions were transformed into theater. The Colosseum, Rome's grandest stage, held tens of thousands of spectators who cheered not only for gladiatorial combat, but also for elaborate executions. Condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths and stories, their deaths carefully choreographed to mimic legendary tragedies. A man playing Orpheus might be torn apart by wild beasts, or a woman cast as a mythic heroine might be burned alive, her cries echoing through the stone amphitheater as the crowd watched with excitement. These killings were not private sentences carried out in silence. They were public performances meant to instill fear, entertain the masses, and remind everyone of the unshakable power of Rome. One of the most chilling punishments in Roman law was the peniculi, a sentence reserved for those convicted of parricide, the murder of one's parent. Unlike crucifixion, which relied on public exposure, the peniculi was a bizarre and terrifying ritual of humiliation. The condemned was sewn into a sack along with live animals, typically a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. Once sealed, the sack was thrown into water, leaving the victim to thrash and suffocate as the panicked animals clawed, bit, and thrashed alongside them. This punishment was designed not only to kill but to symbolize the unnaturalness of murdering one's own bloodline. To the Romans, parricide was a crime against both family and the gods, and so the execution was made into something grotesque and unforgettable. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses of Vesta, also faced uniquely cruel punishments if they broke their vow of chastity. These women were chosen as children and sworn to 30 years of service, guarding the sacred flame that symbolized Rome's eternal power. Their purity was seen as tied to the stability of the empire. If one of them was found guilty of violating her vows, she could not be executed by bloodshed, for her body was considered sacred. Instead, she was buried alive. The condemned vessel would be led to a small underground chamber, given a tiny ration of food and water, and sealed inside. Alone in darkness, she would slowly waste away, her death hidden, but her shame made a matter of public record. The Romans masked this cruelty with ritual, calling it justice, but at its core, it was a chilling display of how even the most revered women were subject to terrifying punishments. Slaves in Rome also endured unimaginable suffering. They were considered property, not people, and their masters had near total control over their lives and deaths. A disobedient slave could be beaten, branded, mutilated, or killed with little consequence. Some punishments were designed specifically to humiliate. There are records of slaves being forced to fight each other in mock gladiatorial battles, not for honor, but purely for the amusement of their owners. After the assassination of Emperor Pedanius Secundus in 61 CE, the Senate decreed that all 400 of his household slaves should be executed, even though only one had committed the murder. The reasoning was clear. Rome would not tolerate even the suggestion of rebellion among slaves. Their mass execution was not only punishment, but a grim warning that the lives of the enslaved were utterly disposable. Even free citizens could be subjected to horrifying treatments if they crossed the wrong lines. Public humiliation was often intertwined with execution. Some were scourged before being put to death, their flesh shredded by whips embedded with bone or metal. Others were paraded through the streets, stripped and mocked before their final punishment. Execution was rarely swift or merciful. It was a drawn-out process meant to break both body and spirit, and the cruelty extended beyond Rome's borders into its conquests. When a city resisted Roman authority, the punishment was often total destruction. Men were slaughtered, children enslaved, and women subjected to horrific violence. The fall of Carthage is one of the most infamous examples. After years of war, the city was razed, its survivors enslaved, and its memory cursed. For Rome, such actions were not excesses but necessary demonstrations of dominance. The empire thrived on fear, and every act of brutality reinforced the message that resistance was futile. Rome's cruelty was not random, but systematic, woven into the fabric of its laws, its entertainment, and its politics. It was a culture where punishment was expected to be harsh, where mercy was rare, and where the suffering of others became a public lesson. The very same civilization that built aqueducts and amphitheaters also engineered torture methods and ritual executions, ensuring that violence remained an inseparable part of daily life. This was the Rome behind the marble statues and Latin inscriptions, a world where human life was cheap, and where the most brutal and inhumane acts were not exceptions but routine. To understand Rome fully, we must confront this darker side. The empire that prided itself on order also thrived on terror. The brutality of Rome was not confined to punishment and executions alone. It extended into the very fabric of daily governance, where cruelty became a tool of politics and personal power. Emperors, in particular, wielded terror as a weapon, ensuring loyalty through fear and eliminating rivals with theatrical displays of violence. One of the most chilling examples comes from the reign of Emperor Caligula, whose excesses became legendary. According to ancient historians, Caligula delighted in using executions as entertainment during his banquets. Noblemen were forced to watch as their peers were tortured or put to death. Sometimes on a whim, the emperor would remind his guests that he held the power of life and death, turning dinners into grotesque spectacles of humiliation. Caligula's cruelty was not unique among emperors. Nero too was infamous for his sadistic streak, accused of setting Christians ablaze as living torches to light his gardens. For Rome's rulers, cruelty was both a performance and a declaration. The emperor was untouchable, and no one else was safe. But even outside the imperial court, Roman justice had a reputation for harshness. The punishment of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was reserved for criminals, prisoners of war, and often early Christians. Victims were stripped naked and thrown into the arena, where lions, leopards, or bears were set upon them. These executions were staged as part of the games, and the crowd roared with excitement as humans were mauled and torn apart. It was not simply about eliminating criminals, but about reinforcing the might of Rome through public terror. For those in the stands, it was entertainment. For those in the arena, it was the most horrific death imaginable. Even the Roman army, the backbone of the empire, practiced its own unique brand of cruelty. Discipline among the legions was ruthless, and punishments for cowardice or desertion were designed to terrify the ranks into obedience. One of the harshest methods was decimation. If a unit was found guilty of mutiny or failure, one soldier out of every 10 was chosen by lot and executed by his comrades, often by stoning or clubbing. The The randomness of the punishment made it even more terrifying. Even the bravest soldier could fall victim simply because of chance. The message was unmistakable, loyalty was demanded, and failure meant collective suffering. Rome's brutality also targeted the conquered. Cities that resisted Roman conquest often endured unspeakable horrors. In the aftermath of defeat, survivors could be enslaved, entire populations displaced, and leaders humiliated in chains during Roman triumphs. These captives were paraded through the streets of Rome, mocked and spat upon before being executed or sold into slavery. The spectacle of the triumph was a double-edged sword. It celebrated Rome's glory, while reminding everyone, from citizens to foreigners, of the devastating consequences of defying Roman might. What made Roman cruelty so distinct was how calculated it was. These punishments were never random acts of savagery. They were carefully constructed messages. Crucifixions lined along highways, beasts devouring criminals in arenas, slaves executed en masse, virgins buried alive. All of these were performances of power. Rome's rulers understood that fear was one of the strongest tools of control, and so cruelty was elevated into an art form. And yet, despite its shocking inhumanity, Rome was not unique in practicing such punishments. What sets it apart is the scale, the organization, and the public nature of its brutality. Other ancient societies executed criminals or enslaved enemies, but Rome turned it into theater. The arenas were massive, capable of hosting tens of thousands, and the executions were woven into the calendar as popular spectacles. Cruelty was normalized. It was part of what it meant to live under Rome. The paradox of Rome is that the same civilization that gave the world innovations in law, engineering, and governance also built its empire on pain and fear. It is a reminder that progress and cruelty can coexist, that the glory of an empire can be inseparable from its darkest practices. To admire Rome's achievements without confronting its brutality is to miss half the story. The legacy of Rome's inhumane acts lingers even today. Crucifixion, once a Roman punishment, became forever tied to the story of Christianity through the execution of Jesus. The arenas, though silent now, still stand as monuments to bloodshed disguised as entertainment. The stories of the Vestal virgins, the parricides sewn into sacks, and the rebels nailed to crosses continue to horrify, because they reveal the extremes to which human cruelty can go when justified by law and power. Ultimately, the brutality of ancient Rome forces us to reflect on a sobering truth. Civilizations are not built only on wisdom and progress, but also on violence and control. Rome's greatness was inseparable from its cruelty, and its history is a warning of how easily justice can become a spectacle, and how suffering can be normalized when it serves the interests of the powerful. And so, when we marvel at Roman roads, aqueducts, or temples, we must also remember the crucifixions along the Appian Way, the screams that once echoed in the Colosseum, and the countless lives broken to sustain the empire. Rome's story is not only one of glory, it is also one of blood. If you found this deep dive into the darkest side of Rome's history fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Torture's Room, and hit the bell icon, so you don't miss more shocking stories of history's most brutal punishments, executions, and forgotten cruelties. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which Roman punishment do you think was the most terrifying? Let's keep uncovering the side of history that textbooks often leave in the shadows.